Thank you for joining us for preparing for PCI webinar. We're excited to bring this to you guys to hopefully give you guys a little bit more context about some of the changes coming up with 4.0, really walk you through an approach, a practical approach on how to address the changes, how to prepare your organization, and be able to be ready for when the audits do come between 24 and 25, and then kind of walk you through some of those changes as well to make sure that you guys understand that. One of the key things that I think it's important to highlight about PCI 4.0 is it is applicable to whether you do a self-assessment or you do a QSA type assessment audit. So let's jump in. I've got a couple slides to talk through as well to hopefully have in the background to give you guys a little bit more context. A little bit about myself. So Ramin, I've been in the cybersecurity industry for nearly 20 years. And in a number of different roles. I've gone from physical security to cybersecurity and covering compliance programs, technology programs. In my last job, I worked at a corporate company that was primarily a payment processor. I really grew with them over time as they went from a 3,000 employee organization to a little over 25,000 when I decided to change careers this year. And it really taught me a lot of different skills, including how to run programs, right? Think about a security, right? Security is no different than any other program in an organization. It is very much a regulated and operations focused, but it's still a program that applies to people, process, and technology. So I've had the opportunities to work on a number of different programs, new compliance mandates, and then also figuring out how do you put security into your new evolving technologies as well. So as we transformed our technology into cloud footprints, how do you bring compliance and have that more of a baked into your process versus an afterthought? And then really my last set of responsibilities in my last job was primarily focused on how do you bring different types of corporate programs into your entities that you've acquired, whether it's compliance, whether it's security, whether it's technologies, and figure out how do you scale out those programs so that they can be efficient in how they operate, so that it's not a fire drill every time PCI 4.0 comes out or whatever the next compliance is. Let's talk about PCI. So PCI 4.0, there's a lot more hype around this than previous versions of PCI. We're currently on PCI 3.2.1. And as you can see just by the naming convention, it's been kind of iterating on 3.0 over the past few years. And they've done a good job of getting more clear in language, getting clear in understanding of controls. And 4.0 takes a lot of that into account, and really it helps clean up a lot of the language where it could be confusing on, if a control is applicable, what's the scope look like? So we did want to kind of talk about some of those as well here and talk about really some of the ones that are going to be more of a hurdle than some that are more focused around clearing up communications. So good news is PCI 4.0 is also going to be a lot more flexible. So it does take into account that there's different types of organizations and it's not a one size fits all kind of situation. So you're going to see a lot more language in the different controls around scoping specific to what your company does and what technologies you use. So there's a lot more flexibility there, and there is room for different type of controls so that it's not just you must have a WAF, no other option than WAF. Right, which has kind of been a lot more of the language in the past. The second one here is outcome-based objectives, right? So it's more looking how to meet the requirements versus exactly how. So they've kind of changed some of that language to give you room to figure out how to apply controls a little bit more to get to an end objective. Enhancing authentication. So there's a lot more focus on authentication, a lot more language around requiring multi-factor authentication, especially in your CDE or cardholder data environment, and being able to access anything in that environment. Some of that is new language, new requirements. And then number 4, I think number 4 is probably going to be one of the biggest changes along with number 5. Number 4 is encryption. So encryption has had a lot of updates here where they're looking for a lot more clarity around what is defined as being encrypted and what is not. For example, in the past, encryption for data at rest, for PAN data, primary account numbers, you were able to get away with disk encryption, or if you had a NAT, a NAS, getting my acronyms wrong, If you had a NAS and the NAS was encrypted or you had disk level encryption, that was enough, right? But now with PCI 4.0, the idea is you're going to encrypt data at rest, including at a database level, right? So this is where the disk level no longer meets that requirement. So this is going to be, to me, I think one of the biggest changes we're going to see companies preparing for, right? So imagine you have data in a database, and last year you got away with, well, you were encrypting that database's disk at the disk level. But now the requirement is you must apply encryption at a field level in your database, right? So it does change how you apply encryption and how you're able to meet that control. And that also applies to data in transit as well, making sure that data is encrypted the whole life cycle of the process, where in the past, the language was a little bit unclear on, what's the mandated requirements around in flight. But now it's very clear what the expectations are for encrypting in flight as well. Continuous monitoring is an interesting one because in the past, the idea was you need to do monitoring. You define kind of a frequency, there's guidelines and requirements there. But now the idea is they want to see continuous monitoring. And really, the way monitoring is defined in the new language is you need to be doing security monitoring, right? So think about that as more traditional. I'm monitoring logs, I'm responding to events 24/7. And then you also need to be monitoring of your controls and making sure your controls are in place. For example, a control could be your devices are logging to your SIM, where if that a device stops logging to your SIM, what PCI 4.0 expects is that you are made aware of that in a very quick fashion, and then you remediate that logging gap or control immediately, and you address it like an incident, right? So this is a really a new requirement on making sure not only do you monitor your logs and you're responding to events, but you're also making sure your controls that enforce PCI are staying implemented and active. And if there is any situation that comes up where those controls are impacted, they expect you to treat it like an incident response scenario to be able to remediate them. And imagine documenting a ticket, right? Having SLAs and responding. So that's what they're going to look to validate some of those as well. 6 is, I think, a really important one. And I would say, it goes in the right direction. They're including new technologies like cloud services, point-to-point encryption, more SaaS-based services in the cloud as well, where some of these in the past were more interpreted by the QSA versus very clear guidelines by the framework itself. So there's more understanding of cloud technologies. They define some of the differences of those technologies and then spell out a little bit more specifically on what controls apply to them, which is helpful. Streamlining documentation, I think they're taking kind of a step back on documentation, where in the past it almost felt like being numbed by the amount of documentation needed and being able to give that to your auditor and having them validate that it was up to par. So from what I'm seeing as well with 4.0, they still require some level of documentation, but they're also going to be looking at how you're operationalizing your process as well, which is good. A lot more focus on vendor management. If you're keeping up with security updates, what's happening in news, there's a lot of concern around who you're connected to as a company and what controls they have, what access they have in your environment, and how can you be able to ensure, an impact from one of your vendors doesn't impact you from a security perspective. So they're going to look a lot more closely around how you're connected to your vendors. Do you have a vendor management program? Do you assess your vendors, right? Looking at some good hygiene around vendors and how you're able to make sure you're managing risks that could be introduced into your environment that way. Number 9, it also from a PCI PCI 4.0, it's good to see as well. They're starting to kind of map it more to other compliances. So we're starting to see a little bit more common language and common requirements between PCI. I've seen some common languages with SOC 2, some CIS type frameworks, some NIST. So we're starting to see a little bit more clarity instead of it being a one-off, mapping to the other frameworks that are out there and helping security programs have something a little bit more universal and mapping to PCI and some of their controls to meet as well so that it can be more integrated into your overall program. To me, when I was managing security programs, my goal was to be secure, and a byproduct of being secure was compliance. And I had mapped compliance to the security program and really just focused more on the security program. And then the last one, a lot more focus around data governance, data retention, being very clear on how data is defined, and then having your definitions around retention and its use more clearly laid out, where they're also going to look at a lot of that language in audits and then be able to validate whether you're following your own process or not. In the past, it was kind of a little bit more vague, where they would ask you things like, you have data retention, what does your data policy look like? But now they're going to double click that and go a lot more in depth. I'll pause there. At a high level, the way some of these controls are going to come out, they're going to come out in two phases. One is 4.0 is going to come out next year, where companies are going to be expected to meet 4.0 requirements by the end of next year. That's 2024. And then some of the controls are in a kind of like a provisioning mode in 2024, where they're more of a guideline. So they're going to look for you to start getting kind of closer to that requirement, but they're not going to formally audit you against some of those controls until 25. And that's something where you have to go a little bit more in depth into the controls and do a mapping exercise to figure out what that impact is going to be, because there is a lot more changes here, right? So if you think about PCI, there's 12 different controls. They've changed every single one of the 12 controls, whether they've cleaned up the language, they've added some new requirements. So I think one of the best exercises that you guys can do that we can talk about after this is really think about, how do you plan for that, right? How can I make sure I understand, what the scope identification looks like? PCI 4.0 talks a lot more about scope than some of the previous versions, where it really tries to be very clear about how to define your scope. And then it wants you to build operational process around validating your scope at least twice a year, right? And that's something that they're going to audit. When they come around, they're going to say, well, show us how over the last year, twice you validated your scope and documented that process. So really, scope and identifying that and being on the same page with your team members is going to be key. And then, as we talked about, performing that gap analysis, having an understanding of, what the controls are expecting, what is my reality in terms of meeting those controls look like, and then what's that delta, right? That delta becomes then a gap list where you can turn into a project or to an effort and then be able to implement against. Resource allocation is always going to be important. Some of these changes I mentioned, they're going to be big, right? The database one alone, I can imagine, how much time and planning that's going to require. I can see some legacy databases as well that could require updating, right? And some of those are very heavy lifts, where it's going to be really important to think about, almost 4.0 like a project, right? Once you've created your Delta list, being able to put a action plan with resources and a timeline together and fund that and be able to communicate that. And then lastly, bring in experts, right? Bring in your auditors if that's who you choose. Bring in third parties like Tech Compass, who we're with, and go through this exercise with them, right? Where it could be almost a paper exercise to go through your scope, go through a gap analysis, come up with your project plan, make sure it makes sense. They can also help you with how to communicate some of the impacts of the changes within your organization as well, and be able to communicate to your executives. Implementation and remediation. So it's timing is everything, right? So we're already in Q3 of 23. Audits start in 24, right? So it depends on when your audit is based on the month, but you're going to see, changes coming up real quick. So the idea is, once you've created your gap analysis, you've got your project plan, it's about implementation, right? So you're going to be updating your policies, right? Imagine you're going to be updating policies and standards to meet new ciphers, new encryption, right? Just general information security policies and standards are going to need to be updated as well. And then your controls, right? Your security measures on how you're meeting those controls are going to be updated. The vendor management, as I mentioned, if you have an informal vendor management program, right? Adopting a new program it's a big undertaking, right? Especially if you have, more than 20 vendors, right? You can imagine that you're going to be taking a closer look at these vendors. You're going to be looking at their SOC report. You're going to be giving them potentially questionnaires to fill out and how they're meeting those controls. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth there as well. And you might be cleaning up how they're accessing your environment if they don't use multi-factor as an example, or if they're using an IPsec tunnel versus if you need an SSL tunnel that is a point in time connection versus an always on. And then training, right? Think about, the amount of training that's going to need to go into your general users, your technology users, and how you're going to impact their behavior and how they are prepared for next year as well. And then testing and monitoring, right? So it's one thing to put together your gap analysis, put together a project, implement those controls and updates. Then you got to test and make sure you're monitoring those controls once they're updated and making sure that they're staying in compliant until you go through the audit process. So it's really important to know how you're going to meet those controls, how you're going to be prepared. So it's really more looking at that continuous monitoring of controls, right? Is the way I think about it. Just like how on the monitoring side, you need to continuously be monitoring your controls. It's no different for all the 12 controls that come in PCI 4.0. And then making sure, lastly, your documentation is up to date, right? You've reviewed them, you know if they're meeting those controls or not, and you're prepared for the audit. And then the last thing is getting ready for having your QSAs or the self-questionnaire that you're going to be filling out and having that pre-audit review done, knowing, what you look like based on the controls and if you're ready to go. If you already have a QSA or if you need to select a QSA, making sure you select one that is knowledgeable of 4.0, right? And as we talked about earlier, your auditors can also be helpful in prepping for an audit, right? So they do offer different services there as well, where it's, I think, really important to engage them early. Don't wait till the audit period is upon you as well, right? And remember, you're hiring the QSA as well. So, don't look at them as here comes an auditor. To a degree, they are trying to strengthen your overall security posture with the compliance here as well. And then you have the third one here. So making sure you have clean execution, right? Anytime you go through an audit, it could really be painful, but the more prepared you are, the more of your artifacts, more of your controls that you've already done as part of your pre-assessment and review, the smoother the transition will go with the auditors, right? So having all that data at hand and being able to kind of start there and then figure out what else they need is really a good place to engage with auditors. And then lastly, if there are remediation requirements, be aware of that. Make sure you're not allowing yourself, the database, for example, encryption example, to be something that you're trying to remediate with the auditors, right? So some of those bigger items need to be addressed ahead of time, but then leave room from a timing perspective to remediate certain gaps that they might identify as well. So if your audit is due December 2024, don't wait till even November to start, right? I would start in like late Q2 as early as possible, just to prepare and be ready for any remediation that needs to be done ahead of time. Okay, given some of the changes coming up, and we kind of walked through some of the approaches, it's really important to think about how to be successful, right? So I really wanted to pull in some success factors that I've had personally in my career, and really I think would be beneficial, right? So some of these are a little bit more of a soft skill. Some of these are more taking the data of what you're doing here and being able to leverage them, right? So I would say number one, the most important thing is make sure you're communicating to your executives, right? To your bosses of the changes coming, right? If your boss is assuming that next year's audit is just another audit, that's an area where we can do a better job of communicating, right? Doing that gap analysis is a really good way to help them understand the scope of work that is needed to be done to be able to be successful in that audit. And getting them on your side, getting the right level of support, the right level of funding early will be really key to the success there. The second part is being very clear about how to scope and creating repeatable definitions. As I mentioned, the process with 4.0 is shifting, where they are looking for your process to validating scope. If you do have changes in your environment, revisiting your scoping and making sure that that is very clear as well. So scoping and having that focus, and if there's going to be change, is going to be key that you have to operationalize, right? Anytime you have a new application or a new system, or if you're going to the cloud, all these things impact your scope, right? And this is where you have to have more of an operational process around that. Have your group of experts that are that can support you, whether it's your QSAs or third party consultants that can help support you to be prepped, to go through the audit or to deal with any remediation. It's good to have a phone a friend to be able to support you through the process. It's interesting. Number four, I like to think about it almost more like sprinting, right? Cross-functional team. So think about the database change we talked about as an example. I can almost see that in my mind as a sprint change, right? Where you have your security, you have your IT, you have your database team, your application teams, and a project manager or scrum master kind of coming together, working together as a cross-functional team to execute some of these changes, right? So, PCI is no different than an application development work, right? You have to really bring in different groups and have ownership from different teams at the table and be able to take part in a collaborative effort. Documentation, right? Be prepared for that documentation. There's a lot more operational process that they're going to want to look at this time. And those aren't things you can just put together last minute, right? They want to see that those processes have been in place, you've been exercising them, and you have evidence to prove that. Training we talked about as well, just like how you train your employees with for security, just like how you do phishing testing, all these different controls. You got to do compliance testing as well, right? Especially anyone in your environment that handles card data, right? From the sales team to your customer support people to your technologists, and knowing what the rules are around how to handle data and what best practices are. Being able to have that self-assessment process so that you can come up with your gap analysis is really key. If you guys haven't done that in the past, it's really healthy to do that ahead of time, given some of the changes we talked about. It's going to be a body of work to address. So it's good to operationalize that, figure out how to communicate that to your executives each time. Think about it like, gamifying it, right? Giving a percentage, giving it, the teams that are doing well. It's really important to have that be repeatable. We've talked about vendor compliance, making sure that executives understand that that's shifting as well and putting a lot more emphasis on it. Ongoing monitoring, as I mentioned, monitoring is shifting to not just be security monitoring of your logs, but also of your controls as well, and being able to remediate those as they come up 24/7, right? So imagine getting, not only a call for malware, at 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning, but you might get a call at 3 a.m. or have to initiate incident response because your firewall stopped logging to your SIM. The expectation there is you're going to treat that no different. And then lastly, having that post-audit action plan, right? So once you've gone through an audit, knowing, how you did and preparing for, when the next one comes up, right? Or if there's any action items that are left. It's also important to note, if you're going to do any pre-assessment or any kind of work like that, do it outside of your audit cycles, right? You don't want to combine the two where you're trying to do a pre-assessment, address some gaps, implement a project, and be in the middle of an audit at the same time, right? Because a lot of those are tapping into the same resources. So it's really important to separate the two. All right, so those are the 10 success factors we had. I get it, every organization is going to be different, but I think some of these are really applicable to how to get there, whether you're doing a self-assessment or you're working with a QSA to come on site and work with you guys to perform the audit. So hopefully this was informational to you. It gave you some value. We do work with companies as well to prepare for PCI 4.0. So if you feel that we can be helpful, Tech Compass can support you with your compliance prep or other security initiatives as well. Otherwise, I appreciate everyone's time and look forward to chatting with you guys.